The house stood finished on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1878, and Micah Keene walked through every room alone, running his calloused fingers along the walls he had built plank by plank, and felt the particular hollow ache of a man who had completed something magnificent for someone who would never see it. 3 years. 3 long years of Wyoming Territory wind and frost and sun, so punishing it cracked the back of your neck open like dry clay. 3 years of hauling timber from the foothills, of mixing mortar until his shoulders screamed, of measuring and remeasuring because Clara Hutchins had told him once, in the soft golden light behind the Silver Bell Saloon in Laramie, that she wanted a home with wide windows so the morning light could pour in like honey. He had built those windows. He had built every single thing she had ever murmured she might want. Every passing fancy she had let slip across her lips in the casual way beautiful women sometimes spoke their desires, not knowing a man nearby was filing each word away like something precious. Clara had left in the spring of 1876, 2 weeks before Micah had broken the first ground. She had left with a cattle buyer from Denver named Hollis Crane, a man who wore a pressed shirt on weekdays and smelled of cologne that came in glass bottles shipped from back east. She had not left a note. She had simply been there one Sunday evening and gone by Monday morning, and the only evidence she had ever existed in Laramie was the faint impression her heel had left in the mud outside the boarding house door, and the way Micah's chest felt like someone had reached inside it and pulled out all the warm parts. But he had already purchased the land. 40 acres of good flat ground outside a small settlement called Caldwell Creek, 2 days' ride west of Laramie, where the grass ran long and green in summer, and the creek itself wound through the property like a silver ribbon some careless traveler had dropped. He had already drawn the plans. He had already, in some private and stubborn chamber of his heart, decided that if he built the house, the reason for building it might eventually follow. It did not follow. He built the house anyway. Not out of self-pity, or at least not entirely. He built it because the land was paid for, and because the act of building was the only thing that silenced the noise in his head, and because somewhere in his 31 years of living, he had developed the deep conviction that a man needed something to show for himself, something that would be standing after he was gone. His father had left him nothing but a name and a bad temper, and his mother had left him nothing at all because she had died of fever when he was 7. The house was the first thing in Micah Keene's life that was entirely and purely his own making. He was proud of it. He could not help being proud of it, even standing alone in it on that cold October Tuesday with no one to admire the wide plank floors, or the kitchen hearth he had set with particular care, or the bedroom with the east-facing window that would catch exactly the kind of morning light a woman with honey-colored hair had once described wanting. His neighbor, an old rancher named Burl Pickett who ran about 40 head of longhorn on the land to the north, had come by to look at the finished house and had stood in the yard with his hands on his hips and said, "Micah, that is a fine piece of work. Shame no one's in it." And Micah had said, "There's me in it," and Burl had just nodded in the way old men nod when they know they're right, and they have the patience to let time prove it for them. Micah had 2 horses, a chestnut gelding named Rope and a younger gray mare he called Dust, and a dog of uncertain heritage named Colt who had 3 legs and a disposition so cheerful it bordered on offensive. He had a small hired hand, a 16-year-old boy from the settlement named Tommy Aldridge, who came 3 mornings a week to help with the ranch work, because Micah had taken on 20 head of cattle and a small flock of chickens, and there was too much to manage alone. He had a rifle, a Colt single-action Army revolver he had bought second-hand in Laramie, and a reputation in Caldwell Creek as a quiet man who was good with his hands and not good at all with small talk. The settlement of Caldwell Creek in 1878 was a modest thing. A general store run by a German immigrant named Otto Schaefer, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a blacksmith, A saloon that was really just 3 walls and a plank bar that Mr. Ennis, the proprietor, referred to grandly as the Frontier House, and about 40 families scattered across the surrounding land in varying states of permanence. The nearest proper town with a telegraph office was Red Bend, a day's hard ride to the southeast, and the nearest railway was in Laramie, which meant that Caldwell Creek existed in a particular state of self-reliance that shaped everyone who lived there. Micah liked it. He liked the quiet. He liked the way you could stand on his porch in the evening and hear nothing for miles except the creek and the wind and occasionally Burl Pickett's cattle lowing in the dark. He had not expected anyone to change that. He had certainly not expected it to change on a November morning in 1878, when the stage rode through the territory, experienced one of its periodic catastrophic events, this one being a wheel that cracked clean off the Red Bend to Laramie coach about 3 miles east of Caldwell Creek on a stretch of trail that wound through a rocky cut in the land. Susan Norris had been on that coach. She had been the only passenger, which was not unusual for the late autumn runs, when most sensible people had either arrived at their destinations or decided to wait out the weather before traveling. Susan was neither sensible nor waiting. She was 26 years old, a schoolteacher from a small Ohio town called Millhaven, and she was traveling west to take up a teaching position in a settlement called Fort Keswick, which she had been informed was approximately 3 days west of Laramie by coach. She had a leather traveling case, a trunk of books and clothing, a letter of employment from the Fort Keswick School Board, and an absolutely unshakable certainty that she was heading in the right direction, which she was not. She would discover much later that Fort Keswick was actually north of Laramie, not west, and that she had been given incorrect directions by a railway porter in Cheyenne who had confused Fort Keswick with another settlement entirely. But on that November morning, all she knew was that the coach had lurched violently, tipped sideways, and deposited her and her traveling case into the cold November grass beside a rocky trail in Wyoming Territory while the driver, a weathered man named Alf Cromwell, stood beside the wrecked wheel and used language she had never heard spoken aloud before. "Can we fix it?" she asked, brushing dried grass from her traveling coat, which was brown wool and practical and which she had bought specifically for this journey. Alf Cromwell looked at the wheel, which had not merely cracked but had essentially disintegrated into several independent and useless pieces. "No, ma'am," he said, "we cannot fix it." "Is there a town nearby?" Alf squinted westward. "Caldwell Creek is maybe 3 miles that way. Small place. Got a livery, last I heard." Susan picked up her traveling case, straightened her hat, and said, "Then I'll walk there." Alf looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was not accustomed to women who solved problems by simply walking toward them. "I'll need to stay with the horses and the mail bag," he said, somewhat apologetically. "I understand completely," she said. "Point me in the right direction." She had been walking perhaps 40 minutes, following the ruts of what passed for a road in this part of the territory, when the sky, which had been a suspicious grayish-white all morning, decided to stop being suspicious and simply delivered a hard, driving sleet that turned the road to freezing mud in approximately 6 minutes. Susan pressed forward with her chin down and her case held against her chest, but she was wearing shoes appropriate for Ohio in November and not for Wyoming Territory mud, and by the time she came within sight of what turned out to be not Caldwell Creek itself, but rather the long fenced approach to Micah Keene's property, she was wet through her coat, her feet were soaking, and she had discovered that the grip on her traveling case had developed a crack. She saw the house first. It rose out of the gray November landscape with a quality she would struggle later to describe accurately, because describing it accurately would have required words like unexpected and solid and somehow hopeful. And those were not the kinds of words a schoolteacher from Ohio typically applied to buildings she stumbled upon in the middle of a sleet storm. The house was 2 stories, built of good pale timber, with a wide porch running the full length of the front and windows, large generous windows that caught even the dull November light and held it. There was smoke rising from the chimney. There was a fence line that ran perfectly level and true, and beyond the house she could see the darker shape of a barn and some structure that might have been a chicken coop, and it was all so clean and cared for and unexpectedly beautiful that she stopped walking for a moment despite the sleet. Then she walked to the front door and knocked. Micah had been in the kitchen. He had been eating cornbread with a cup of coffee and reading a 6-week-old copy of the Cheyenne Daily Leader that Burl Pickett had brought over, not because he was particularly interested in the news, which was largely concerning land speculation and cattle prices, but because he had run out of other reading material. He had the newspaper flat on the table and the coffee in his left hand when the knock came, and he looked up with the expression of a man who is genuinely surprised, because people did not generally knock on his door on a Wednesday morning in a sleet storm. He opened the door. Susan Norris was standing on his porch with sleet in her hair and mud on her shoes, and her traveling case held against her chest like something she was determined not to put down. And she was looking at him with brown eyes that were direct and clear despite the cold that had reddened her cheeks and the general state of soaking dampness that characterized her appearance. She was not, he noticed in the way a man notices such things before his brain can stop him, anything like Clara Hutchins. She did not have honey-colored hair. She had dark brown hair that was coming loose from its pins and curling slightly at the edges from the wet, and she was not soft and pretty in the way Clara had been soft and pretty. She was something more definite than that. A face that was interesting rather than immediately beautiful, with a mouth that looked like it said true things, and those steady brown eyes. "I am sorry to bother you," she said. "The stage broke down about 3 miles back. I was told Caldwell Creek is nearby, and I was hoping I might ask directions, and perhaps use your porch until the sleet passes." He stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said. She hesitated. "I'm a stranger." "You are a stranger standing in a sleet storm," he said. "Come inside." She came inside. She stood in his kitchen and dripped sleet onto his floor and looked around the room with those direct brown eyes, and Micah put the coffee pot back on the stove and reached for another cup. He did not ask her name yet, because that felt like a thing that could wait until a person was warm. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his at the kitchen table. She sat, but she held the traveling case on her lap. He noticed that too. He put the coffee cup in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it without drinking immediately, which was what a person did when their hands were very cold and needed the warmth before anything else. He went to the other room and came back with a blanket, which he set on the chair beside her without making any comment about it, and she pulled it around her shoulders without making any comment either. "There's cornbread," he said. "Thank you," she said, and then she drank some coffee and said, "My name is Susan Norris. I'm a schoolteacher from Millhaven, Ohio. I was on the stage to Fort Keswick." Micah sat down across from her. "Fort Keswick," he said. "Yes, I have a position there." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Fort Keswick is north of Laramie," he said, "not west." Susan Norris looked at him for a moment in the particular way that a person looks when someone has just confirmed something they had been quietly suspecting for the last 3 hours but had been hoping was wrong. "North," she said. "'Bout 2 days north of Laramie, as I understand it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The porter in Cheyenne told me west." "Porters make mistakes," Micah said. "I had a feeling something was wrong," she said. "The country didn't look right. I had a map." "Maps of this territory are frequently wrong," he said, "even the good ones." Another silence, but a different quality of silence. She was recalibrating, he could see it, adjusting her internal sense of where she was and what this meant, and she was doing it quietly and without visible panic, which impressed him. "I see," she finally said. She drank more coffee. "Well, the immediate concern is the stage. The driver stayed with the horses and the mail. I should let someone in Caldwell Creek know so they can send help. I'll ride out," he said, "after the sleet stops." "It's your morning," she said, and she said it in a way that was not performative modesty but genuine consideration, and that was different too from what he was accustomed to. "I've got nothing pressing enough to outrank a man sitting in a sleet storm with a broken wheel," Micah said. He pushed the cornbread toward her. "Eat something." She ate the cornbread. She had good manners, but she was hungry, and she did not pretend she wasn't, which he found, again, unexpectedly pleasing. Colt, the three-legged dog, appeared from the corner of the kitchen where he had been sleeping, clicked across the floor on his uneven rhythm, and put his head on Susan's knee. She looked down at him. "He was shot when he was a pup," Micah said. "Survived but lost the leg." "What's his name?" "Colt." She smiled. It was the first smile, and it changed her face considerably, not into something more conventionally beautiful, but into something warmer and more alive, and it arrived so unexpectedly in the middle of a very practical conversation about injured dogs that Micah felt it hit him somewhere in the chest before he could do anything sensible about it. "That's a good name," she said, and scratched behind Colt's ears. They stayed in the kitchen while the sleet fell and the stove threw its warm light, and they talked in the cautious way of strangers who are doing the preliminary work of figuring out whether the other person is trustworthy. She asked about the territory, practical questions about distances and roads and what Caldwell Creek was like. He answered them honestly. He asked about Ohio, about what had led her to come so far for a teaching position, and she said, "There were 4 teachers and 2 positions available in Millhaven, and I had rather been hoping to see something beyond what I already knew," and he said, "That's a fair reason," and meant it. When the sleet thinned to a drizzle and the drizzle eventually stopped, he saddled Rope and rode the 3 miles to where Alf Cromwell was sitting on the side of the wrecked coach looking aggrieved, told him to wait, rode into Caldwell Creek, found a man named Pete Darrow who had a wagon and tools, and by mid-afternoon had Alf Cromwell and the coach mail bag delivered to Otto Schaefer's general store, where Otto offered the coach driver a spot in the small back room he occasionally let to travelers. Susan's trunk, which had been strapped to the top of the coach, was brought in on Pete Darrow's wagon and deposited in the general store. Susan herself had walked to Caldwell Creek that afternoon, drier and rested, and was standing at Otto Schaefer's counter discussing the situation with a practicality that Otto, who had a certain nervousness around decisive women, clearly found both impressive and slightly alarming. Micah came in while this was happening, and Otto looked at him with the expression of a man who hopes another man will take over a conversation. "The nearest telegraph is in Red Bend," Micah said, addressing Susan. "Day's ride. You could wire Fort Keswick from there, let them know your situation, get direction on the correct route." "And the stage?" she asked. "Alf says he can rig something temporary on the wheel, get it back to Laramie, but it'll take 2 or 3 days and he won't be taking passengers." She nodded, thinking. "Is there anywhere to stay in Caldwell Creek?" Otto said, apologetically, that he had only the 1 back room and it was currently occupied by Alf Cromwell. "The church has a side room," said Micah, and then stopped, because what he had been about to say was that it wasn't comfortable and that she was welcome to stay at his place, and he did not know this woman and she did not know him, and there were things that were proper and things that were not, and he was trying to be a man who thought about that. But there was also a house with 4 empty rooms and a kitchen with a working stove, and he had made the 2nd bedroom up with a real bed frame and a good mattress because he had imagined once that a woman named Clara might come and stay while the house was being finished. He said it anyway. "I have a house with a spare room. It's half a mile outside of town. If you want a proper bed and a roof, you're welcome to it until you can sort out your arrangements." Susan Norris looked at him. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful assessment of a woman who had traveled alone across several states and knew the difference between an offer made from kindness and an offer made from something else. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied the assessment. "That's very generous," she said. "I accept." Otto Schaefer exhaled. That was how Susan Norris came to stay in the spare room of a house that Micah Keene had spent 3 years building for a woman who had left him without a word. He carried her trunk on his horse. She walked beside him, because she had already walked 3 miles once today and apparently had no objection to another half mile. The sleet had left everything washed and cold and clear, and the late afternoon light was that particular pale gold that Wyoming Territory produced sometimes in autumn, slanting low across the grass and turning the creek, which ran along the side of the road, into something that looked like hammered copper. She saw the house again from the road and she stopped walking. Not for long, just a breath, but he saw it. "You built it?" she asked. "I did." "How long?" 3 years mostly. She looked at it for another moment with those steady brown eyes. "It's beautiful," she said. And she said it the way a person says a true thing without decoration, simply because it was the truth. Something moved in Micah's chest that he did not immediately have a name for. He showed her the spare room, which was clean and had a good quilt on the bed and a small table with a lamp. He showed her where the water pump was in the kitchen, and where the outhouse was, and where he kept the extra firewood in case the night turned cold, which in Wyoming Territory in November it was going to, without any doubt whatsoever. She thanked him with quiet directness and asked if he needed help with supper, and he said he was making a venison stew, and she was welcome to sit in the kitchen while he made it if she liked, and she said she would rather help if she could because she had been sitting in coaches and trains for 4 days, and her hands wanted something useful to do. They made the stew together. He cut the venison, and she peeled potatoes with the same efficient economy of motion she seemed to apply to everything. And Colt sat between them and watched the proceedings with the philosophical interest of a dog who understood that kitchens were places where good things happened. "Where did you learn to build like that?" she asked, gesturing generally toward the walls around them. "My grandfather," he said. "He was a carpenter in Virginia. I spent summers with him when I was young. He had opinions about wood." "What kind of opinions?" "He believed every piece of wood had a right side and a wrong side," Micah said. "You had to learn to read it, know which way the grain was trying to go and work with it, not against it." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "That seems like a philosophy you could apply to more than wood." "He applied it to most things," Micah agreed. She smiled again, that same unexpected warming of her face, and dropped the peeled potatoes into the pot. "Why did you come all the way out here?" she asked. "Wyoming Territory. It's a considerable distance from Virginia." "Father drank," he said, and left it at that, because that was usually enough of an explanation, and he had not told that particular truth to very many people in Caldwell Creek. He wasn't sure why he told it to her so easily. She didn't offer sympathy. She said, "You were looking for something to build," and she said it not as a question but as a recognition, the way someone identifies a thing they have seen before. He looked at her. "I suppose I was." "I understand that," she said. "Not the building, but the looking for something worth making." They ate the stew at the kitchen table with Colt arranged hopefully at their feet, and she asked about the land and the cattle and the settlement, and he asked about her teaching and what the school in Millhaven had been like, and she told him about the 40 children in one room and the way you learned very quickly to teach 4 grade levels simultaneously, and how the thing she loved most was the exact moment when a child understood something they had not understood before. That visible shift in their face like a lamp being lit. He listened to her talk and found that he did not want her to stop. After supper she helped him wash the dishes without being asked, and then she said good night and went to the spare room with the lamp, and he sat alone at the kitchen table with his coffee and Colt's head on his boot and thought about the phrase she had used, "It's beautiful." How she had said it looking at the house from the road. Just like that, clean and simple, the way you said something true. He thought about the fact that Clara Hutchins, who was the reason every window faced exactly east, had never seen the house. Had never known it existed. Was presumably living in Denver with Holly's Crane in a proper house with wallpaper and a maid. Or perhaps she was on to someone else entirely, because Clara had always moved toward the warmth and away from anything that required waiting. He thought about Susan Norris, who was 30 miles off course in Wyoming Territory in November, because a railway porter had given her wrong directions, sleeping in a spare room that had been built for a different woman. He thought that life had a way of being extraordinarily peculiar. In the morning she came to breakfast already dressed, her hair neatly pinned, and helped him make eggs without being asked, and ate them at the table while telling him about the proper route to Fort Keswick as best as she had been able to work out from his territory map, which she had borrowed and apparently studied for some time before sleep. He looked at the map and confirmed her route, and they discussed the matter of riding to Red Bend to wire the Fort Keswick school board. "I'd like to ride today if you go with me," she said. "I don't know the country." "I'll take you," he said. It was a full day's ride. They left at first light on rope and dust, and the territory opened up around them in the pale November morning, wide and cold and startlingly beautiful in the way it was only in this part of the country, where the sky was so immense that it made a person feel simultaneously very small and very alive. She was a competent rider. Not flashy, not experienced in the way of people who had grown up on horses, but competent and unafraid, which was what counted on a long ride through territory with uncertain footing. She asked questions about everything she saw. The name of a particular type of grass, whether those mountains were the Laramie Range or something else. What the cattle ate in winter when the grass went hard. He answered all of them, and between questions they rode in a silence that was, he noticed, entirely comfortable, which was not nothing. Comfortable silence with a near stranger was a rarer thing than most people supposed. In Red Bend, she sent her wire to Fort Keswick and received a reply 3 hours later that informed her, via the Fort Keswick School Board secretary, that the position had unfortunately been filled 2 weeks ago by a local candidate, as Susan had been assumed lost or changed in her plans given her non-arrival. She read the telegram in the telegraph office. He watched her read it. He watched her face go through several things in rapid succession, none of which was tears or collapse, and then arrive at a kind of still, deliberate calm. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She folded the telegram and put it in her coat pocket. "I'm unemployed," she said, "in Wyoming Territory with a trunk of books and $30 in travel money." "That's a fair summary," he said. She looked at him. "I don't suppose there's a school in Caldwell Creek." "There is," he said. "Uses the church. Mabel Crow teaches it, but she's getting married in the spring and going to Denver." Susan Norris blinked. "I see," she said. "You'd have to talk to Reverend Foster, who handles the school board out there, along with Otto Schaefer and Burl Pickett," he said. "It's not a paid position exactly, collection from the families." "How many children?" 12 or so last I knew." She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Are you suggesting I stay in Caldwell Creek?" "I'm telling you the facts," he said carefully. "What you do with them is your own business." There was a quiet moment in the telegraph office while the operator pretended to be very interested in a piece of equipment to their left. "It's not Ohio," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." "But it's real," she said, in a way that seemed to be a conversation she was having with herself more than with him. "Generally, yes," he said. They ate at a small restaurant in Red Bend, a place run by a Mexican family named Vega that served the best chili Micah had eaten in Wyoming. And they talked about the school at Caldwell Creek and whether she might find it worthwhile and what her family in Ohio would think. And she said her parents were dead, and her brother was in Chicago and thought she was already at Fort Keswick. She said this without self-pity either, just as information, which was becoming a pattern he was recognizing in her, the way she stated hard facts cleanly and moved on. On the ride back, with the sun going orange and low over the western horizon, she was quieter than the morning ride had been, and he didn't push conversation because he could tell she was thinking something through. Halfway back she said, without looking at him, "When you built the house, was it for someone specific?" He kept his eyes on the trail. "Yes." "She left," Susan said. "It wasn't a question." "Before I started," he said, "but I built it anyway." "Why?" He thought about it honestly. "Because I needed the work," he said, "and because I wanted to find out if I could." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you find out?" "House is standing," he said. She smiled at the trail ahead of her. "It is," she said. "It really is quite something." He looked at her profile in the orange evening light, the dark hair escaping its pins in the wind, the straight back, the way she sat the horse like someone who had decided to be competent at everything she undertook. He thought, very quietly, in a part of himself he did not examine too closely. Clara Hutchins did not deserve that house. They arrived back at the house after dark, and he made coffee and she made biscuits from the flour and lard she had found in his kitchen, which she offered to pay for, and which he told her was unnecessary. And they ate biscuits with honey while Colt performed his familiar routine of philosophical observation from the floor. Over the next 3 days, Susan Norris wore the house in gradually, the way a person does when they are careful not to assume too much but cannot help responding to a space that suits them. She reorganized his kitchen shelves with his permission in a way that was logically defensible, and that he found, once she had done it, genuinely better. She brought 2 of her books out of her trunk and set them on the kitchen windowsill, a thick dictionary and a collection of essays by a writer named Emerson, and he picked up the Emerson after supper one night and read 3 pages and said, "He makes sense," and she said, "He does mostly," as though the qualifier were important. She met Reverend Foster on the second day, because Micah took her to the church on a Tuesday morning when he had business in Caldwell Creek. Reverend Foster, who was a serious man of 40 with a wife and 4 children, and a genuine commitment to education in the settlement, talked to Susan for 2 hours. Micah sat outside on the church steps and watched the creek and waited. When they came out, Susan had the look of a woman who had said yes to something. "He's offered me the school position starting in January when Miss Crow's term ends," she said. "The families will pay what they can. He's going to ask around about lodgings." Micah looked at the church, and then at Susan, and then said, carefully, "There's a spare room at my place until something permanent arranges itself, if that's acceptable." She looked at him. There was color in her cheeks that might have been the cold, but he didn't think it was only the cold. "There are people in towns like this who talk," she said. "There are people in towns like this who talk about everything," he said. "If it bothers you, Reverend Foster has said you can board with his family, but they have 4 children and a small house." "Does it bother you?" she asked. "What people say?" He considered this. "I've been building a house alone on 40 acres for 3 years," he said. "I think we've established that I don't pay much attention to what other people say." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a genuine one, not a polite social sound but a real laugh, and it was warm and clear and made Colt look up from the church steps with an expression of surprised delight. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." The weeks that followed were the strangest and quietly most significant of Micah's life. He tried, with moderate success, to be a person who was simply providing lodging to someone who needed it, and he told himself that the fact that the house felt different with her in it was simply the practical difference between a house that had a person and a house that was empty, and nothing more complicated than that. But then she would do something like come to the barn one morning and help him with the horses without being asked, working methodically and without fuss, talking to dust in a low, reasonable voice that the young mare responded to immediately. Or she would be sitting at the kitchen table in the evening grading papers she had already taken on from Mabel Crow as a transition, and he would come in from the cold, and she would look up with that direct brown gaze and say, "There's coffee still on the stove." And somehow the phrase, "there's coffee still on the stove," was the warmest thing he had heard in years. She was not easy in the way that Clara had been easy. Clara had moved through a room like sunlight, and everyone had watched her, and she had known it and enjoyed it with a simple animal pleasure that was entirely natural to her. Susan moved through a room like she was getting something done, but occasionally she would pause and look at something, a particular quality of light on the floor or the way the creek looked at evening, and the expression on her face in those pauses was something he began to look forward to seeing. He did not tell her about Clara, not all of it, not immediately. He had told her someone had left, which was the essential fact. The details were another matter. She found out about the details from Burl Pickett, who was not a man given to gossip, but was also not a man who thought carefully about what he said before he said it. Burl came by on a cold afternoon in late November, ostensibly to discuss whether Micah was interested in taking on 2 more head from Burl's herd over winter, and found both Micah and Susan in the kitchen drinking coffee. Burl sat down and accepted coffee and looked at Susan with open curiosity and said, "You're the teacher," and she said, "I will be, yes," and Burl said, "Good. We need one," and then, apparently satisfied with that exchange, turned to Micah and said, "You know you built this house for Clara Hutchins and she ran off to Denver before you even started." Micah said, "Burl." Burl said, "What? It's no secret. Whole Creek knows it. Man spent 3 years building a house for a woman who was gone before the foundation was laid." He shook his head with a kind of admiring bewilderment. "Damnedest thing." Susan was looking at her coffee cup. Micah was looking at Burl with an expression that Burl eventually recognized as a request to stop talking, which Burl honored after a short delay. After Burl left, taking himself and his unfiltered honesty back to his 40 head of longhorn, there was a quiet in the kitchen. 3 years, Susan said. "Yes." And she'd already gone to Denver. "Yes." She looked up. Her expression was not pity, which he had half expected and would have found suffocating. It was something more measured. "That's a long time to keep going," she said. "The work made sense," he said, "even when the original reason stopped making sense." She was quiet a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands the way she did when she was thinking carefully. "You built it for the right reasons eventually," she said, "even if the first reason was wrong." He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she didn't seem to require anything more. Tommy Aldridge, Micah's young hired hand, met Susan 3 times that first week she was in the house, and by the 4th day was showing off shamelessly in the barn, performing increasingly unnecessary demonstrations of his skill at tossing a rope while she watched with patient amusement. He was 16, and it was as harmless as puppy behavior, and Micah found himself experiencing a reaction to it that he recognized, after a short internal argument, as jealousy, which was both inconvenient and informative. "He's sweet," Susan said that evening when Tommy had gone home. "He's 16, Micah said, in a tone that he attempted to make neutral. Susan looked at him. Her eyes were very direct, and he was coming to understand, an excellent instinct for what other people were actually thinking. "Yes," she agreed, and there was something in the way she said it that told him she knew exactly what he had meant and was choosing to let him figure out his own feelings without her help. He respected that, even as it was frustrating. December arrived hard and cold, the way Wyoming Territory Decembers did, with wind that had traveled a great distance and gathered grievances along the way, and Micah moved the cattle into the lower pasture, where a natural break in the land cut the wind, and stacked additional wood against the house, and Tommy came more often because the winter work was its own particular set of demands. Susan began teaching at the church school on the first Monday in December, when Mabel Crow introduced her to the 12 children of Caldwell Creek, and then effectively stepped aside, because Mabel Crow, though a kind woman, had been primarily passing time until her upcoming marriage and was relieved to be relieved. Susan took over with a calmness that impressed even Reverend Foster, who had been quietly uncertain about a teacher from Ohio arriving in a sleet storm with the wrong directions. Micah heard about it from Otto Schaefer, who had a daughter named Elsa, 9 years old, who came home from the school's second day, and told her father that the new teacher knew 12 different ways to explain multiplication, and had also made a boy named Aaron Pickett, Burl's grandson, sit in a corner for pulling her braids, and had not shouted at him once, but had used a voice that Aaron reportedly found more frightening than shouting. "She's good," Otto said, when Micah came in for supplies that week. "She is," Micah agreed. Otto looked at him. Otto was 53 years old and had been married for 29 years and had a keen, kindly eye for certain things. "Interesting that she ended up here," he said, conversationally. "Stage broke down," Micah said. "Stages break down all the time on that road," Otto said. "Most people walk back to Laramie, not forward." She went forward, Micah said. She did, said Otto, and smiled to himself over his ledger. The evenings at the house were what Micah began to think of as the best part of the day, which was something he would not have predicted, and which he examined suspiciously each time he noticed it. They fell into a routine the way people do when they share a space honestly, without forcing it or performing it. She cooked Tuesday and Thursday because she said she liked to cook, and he did not. And he cooked the other days because he was capable even if not enthusiastic. And they ate together at the kitchen table with Colt between them and the stove ticking with warmth against the winter cold. She read in the evenings. He worked on things, mending leather or sharpening tools or occasionally sitting with his own battered copy of a natural history book he had owned for years. And the silence between them in these evenings was not empty but full. The way a good room is full, with the presence of another person who was not performing their existence for you, but simply being in it. On a Friday evening in mid-December, a week before Christmas, she looked up from a paper she was grading and said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "Yes," he said. "Did you love her, Clara?" He thought about this honestly. "I thought I did," he said. "The way you think you love something when you're 30 years old and lonely and it's beautiful and easy. I don't know if that's the same thing." She nodded slowly. "Did it hurt when she left?" "Yes," he said. For a while he paused. "Less than I would have expected, after a while." "Because of the building," she said. "Because of the building," he agreed. She went back to her paper. He went back to his work. After a few minutes she said, without looking up, "For what it's worth, I think she was very foolish." He stopped what he was doing. He looked at her, this woman bent over her schoolwork in his kitchen with her dark hair coming loose from its pins again the way it always did by evening, and the lamplight warm on the side of her face, and outside the Wyoming winter pressing its cold against the windows he had built to catch a different woman's morning light. "Susan," he said. She looked up. He did not quite know what he had meant to say next, and apparently his face said it anyway because something shifted in hers, not dramatically but certainly. "Go to sleep, Micah," she said gently. "It's late." He went to sleep, but it took longer than usual. Christmas in Caldwell Creek in 1878 was a modest affair. The church held a service, and all 40 families attended, and Otto Schaefer had received a shipment of hard candy from Laramie that he put out in a bowl, and Susan organized the school children to sing carols, which they did with more enthusiasm than precision. Micah stood at the back of the church and watched her conduct the children with her arms moving in the encouraging way she had, and Aaron Pickett, who had apparently forgiven her the corner incident, sang louder than anyone. Burl Pickett's wife, Nadine, a short, sturdy woman of 60 who had opinions about everything and was not shy about them, came up to Micah after the service and said, "Your schoolteacher is wonderful." And Micah said, "She's the settlement schoolteacher." And Nadine said, in a way that contained a great deal of information. On Christmas Day itself they ate dinner at the house, just the two of them and Colt and the horses in the barn and the chickens doing what chickens did. And she had made a proper Christmas cake from a recipe she had brought from Ohio, written in her mother's handwriting on a folded piece of paper she carried in her trunk. And it was the first Christmas cake Micah had eaten in 5 years, and it was very good. He had gotten her a gift. He had thought about it for 2 weeks and ultimately decided on a pair of good leather riding gloves from Otto's store, because her Ohio gloves were not adequate for Wyoming Territory riding, and she had been riding out with him regularly by then, learning the land, and he had seen her hands in the cold, and the sight had bothered him in the quiet way that small discomforts in another person began to bother him. She opened the package and looked at the gloves, and her face did the thing it did when something genuinely moved her, which was a stillness first and then the slow, warm arrival of expression. She said, "Micah," in a voice that was not performative. "Your hands were cold," he said. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. "They're exactly right." She had gotten him something too, a leather-bound notebook with blank pages, because she had noticed that he kept lists and measurements and observations on loose pieces of paper that got mislaid, and she had bought it from Otto on a day when she had told him she was going in for flour. He held it and felt the weight of the thing, real and solid, and felt also the fact that she had looked at him closely enough to notice the loose papers. He felt it in his chest, that fact. They sat by the fire after dinner, which was the kitchen fireplace since the sitting room one worked, but he didn't often use it, and they talked for a long time about things both small and large. His grandfather in Virginia, her mother's kitchen in Millhaven, the 3 Octobers he had spent framing the house in the wind, the school in Ohio where she had first started teaching, the dog Colt who was demonstrably content and demonstrably aware that today was a day of special significance. Around 9 o'clock she leaned her head back against the chair and closed her eyes for a moment with a small smile on her face, and he looked at her in the firelight and thought with absolute clarity, I do not want this to end. Not the evening, not the living arrangement, not whatever this was that had arrived uninvited and without direction in his kitchen 4 weeks ago, 30 miles off course in a sleet storm. He did not say it. He was not, by nature, a man who said the large, true things without considerable preparation. But he thought it clearly and settled it in himself the way he settled things he meant, and moved on. The new year came in cold and ordinary and went about its business. January brought a hard freeze that lasted 3 weeks and required the two of them to break ice on the creek for the cattle every morning, which was work that was done more efficiently by 2 people than one, and which involved a great deal of proximity in the cold, gray winter dawns, their breaths showing white in the air, their shoulders occasionally almost touching. She had learned over the weeks exactly how he organized things and respected the logic of it, and he had learned the particular way she went quiet when she was thinking hard about something, and the difference between her concentrating silence and her unhappy silence. Both were quiet, but one had a forward lean, and the other had a very slight tension at the corner of her mouth. And the fact that she took her coffee black and strong and would drink a second cup only if it was as good as the first. On a Sunday in late January, they rode out to a place he knew in the southern part of the property where the land rose slightly, and you could see across a remarkable distance, 40 or 50 miles of open territory, mountains pale and enormous in the west, the whole country laid out in its winter colors of gray and tan and the deep blue shadow of the sky. They stopped the horses at the top of the rise and looked out. "It's so enormous," she said. Not with fear, but with the kind of wonder that is almost unbearable. "Yes," he said. "Ohio is beautiful too," she said, "but it's a small kind of beautiful, arranged. This is," she gestured because words were apparently insufficient. "It asks something of you," he said. "The size, you have to decide whether you're going to be frightened by it or not." She looked at him. "What did you decide?" "That the size was the point," he said. "All that room, no one telling you what's already been decided." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the country. "That's why you came west. That's why I stayed." She turned to look at him fully, and the winter light was very clear and white, and it made everything exact, no shadows to hide in. "I think I might stay too," she said, "if the school keeps on." "The school will keep on," he said. He was looking at her. "The children need you. Is that the reason to stay?" She asked, and her voice was very calm and her eyes were very steady. He could feel his own heartbeat, which was not something he was accustomed to noticing. "It's a reason," he said. He paused. "I'd rather you had more than one." The quiet that followed was the loudest quiet he had ever been in. "Micah," she said. "Susan," he said. They were still on horseback on a January hillside 50 miles from anything a stranger would call civilization. And the wind was cold, and the mountains were enormous, and Colt was sitting below on the trail with his 3 legs, and his cheerful philosophy looking up at them, both with what could only be described as encouragement. "I want to say something true," she said, "without being improper." "Say it," he said. "I came here by accident," she said. "Wrong directions, broken wheel. I had no intention of stopping, let alone staying. But I have found myself," she paused, choosing words carefully, the way she did when words were important. "I have found myself more at home in the last 2 months than I have been in a long time." and I think you are the most decent man I have met in my life, and I would very much like to, another pause, not be someone who is simply boarding at your house. He looked at her for a long moment in the winter light. I would very much like that too, he said. The not being a boarder part. She laughed, and this time the laugh was half relief and half real joy, and the horses shifted beneath them in the cold, and Colt did something on the trail below that was probably celebratory. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, her gloved hand, the good leather riding gloves he had bought for Christmas because her hands were cold, and she let him hold it and looked at him with her honest brown eyes, and the whole enormous Wyoming Territory spread itself around them like it was showing off. He did not kiss her that day, because there was time, and he was a man who believed in doing things with appropriate care. But he held her hand on the ride back across the property, and she did not let go until they needed both hands to manage the gate. That evening he cooked supper, and she set the table and they ate together with the specific and different quality of two people who have said a true thing, and are in the process of deciding what to do next, which was a quality composed equally of happiness and a kind of pleasant nervousness that made everything slightly more vivid than it usually was. After supper, while she was washing the dishes and he was drying them, which was a task they had fallen into without discussion because it made logistical sense, he said, "I want to say something too." She turned from the basin, water on her hands, a dish towel over her shoulder. "I thought I built this house for someone else," he said, "and then I thought I built it for myself, and now I think I built it for reasons I didn't understand at the time, which is, I think, how the best things tend to happen." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the basin and said, in a voice that was very carefully controlled and very warm at the same time, "That is the most poetic thing you have ever said." "Don't get used to it," he said. "I don't do it often." "I'll remember it precisely," she said, "for exactly that reason." He smiled. He was not a man who smiled often, and she had noticed this, had once told him that he kept his smiles like something he was saving for the right occasions, and when they appeared, they were worth the wait. He smiled now at the dishes in his kitchen, and it was absolutely worth the wait. February in Wyoming Territory in 1879 was a month that required everything from you and gave you in return only the knowledge that you had survived it, which was perhaps sufficient. The freeze broke briefly in the first week, long enough to become deceptive, and then returned with greater force, and 3 of Micah's cattle died in a 3-day storm that was the worst cold he had seen since he came to the territory. He and Tommy Aldridge worked for 16 hours in 2 of those days just managing what could be managed, and Susan came out in the middle of the second day with hot coffee in a covered pot and biscuits wrapped in cloth and asked, practically, what she could do. He set her to breaking ice on the water trough because Tommy was needed elsewhere, and she broke it without complaint for an hour in the cold, and afterward came inside and made soup from salt pork and dried beans, and had it on the table when he and Tommy finally came in half frozen and defeated, and Tommy Aldridge, who was 16, and at an age when being given soup by a pretty teacher in the aftermath of catastrophe strikes very deep, told Micah afterward that Miss Norris was the best person in Wyoming Territory, and Micah said, with a sincerity that surprised them both, "Yes, she is." The 3 lost cattle were a real loss, and he spent 3 evenings working his finances in the new notebook she had given him for Christmas, trying to see where he had room and where he did not. She did not ask about the finances, but she saw the notebook on the table and understood what it meant, and on the 4th evening she sat down across from him and said, "I'd like to help." "You don't need to," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to. I have my salary from the school. It's not much, but if it helps with the spring herd, I'd like it too." He looked up from the notebook. "Susan, don't be proud," she said. "I'm not asking to own your cattle. I'm asking to be useful to something I care about." The word care sat in the air between them. "I'll think about it," he said, which was his way of saying yes. He thought about it for 1 day and then said yes. and she contributed $12 toward 2 replacement head from a rancher 20 miles east who was reducing his herd for spring. And the transaction was handled with the same quiet practicality with which she handled most things. And Micah thought that if he had been in any remaining doubt about his feelings, the way she said "do not be proud" and meant it as a kindness rather than a criticism would have settled the matter entirely. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday in late February, on the front porch of the house on a morning when the first suggestion of spring was in the air, not warm yet, but less absolutely cold, and the creek was making more noise than it had been making for months because something under the ice was beginning to move. They had been standing on the porch with coffee, looking at the property, the bare fields that would green up in 6 weeks if the weather cooperated, the fence lines that needed attention, the barn with its reliable solid presence, the whole 40 acres that he had loved and built and worked for 3 years, and she had been talking about the school's spring term and what she intended to teach, and he had been listening, and had also been looking at the side of her face in the morning light. He had been thinking, with considerable internal clarity, that he was going to stop waiting for the right occasion, and that this occasion, imperfect and cold and ordinary, was as good as any. She had turned to look at him and found him already looking, and whatever she read in his face made her stop talking. He put his coffee cup on the porch railing and turned to face her fully, and she looked up at him with those steady brown eyes that had looked at him honestly from the very first moment on his porch in the sleet, and he put his hand along the side of her face, his calloused thumb against her cheek, and kissed her. She kissed him back immediately and without any performance or hesitation, the way she did everything, with her whole self present. And it was not elegant or particularly graceful because they both still had their coffee cups and neither of them had anticipated the precise logistics. But it was true and warm and real. And when they stepped back from each other, she was slightly flushed and looking at him with an expression that was better than anything he had imagined, and he had been imagining it for a while. "Finally," she said, which was very much the most honest thing she could have said. "I was working up to it," he said. "You were working up to it for 2 months," she said. "I like to be sure," he said. She put her hand on his chest, just briefly, flat-palmed over his heartbeat, and looked at him. "Are you sure?" she asked, and the question was not about the kiss. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said, and meant it with the totality of a man who had spent 3 years building things that mattered and had learned to know the difference between something solid and something hollow. Spring came and brought with it the particular business of the Wyoming Territory in 1879, which included the need to drive the cattle to new pasture as the grass greened, the fence repairs that every winter made necessary, the arrival of a peddler who came through Caldwell Creek with a wagon of goods every April, and was a source of considerable excitement for the settlement, and the school's spring term which Susan threw herself into with the energy she brought to everything she cared about. The school had grown. Word had spread, the way word spread in small places, that the new teacher was remarkable, and 2 families who had not previously sent their children had started doing so. There were now 16 students, ranging from 6-year-old Louisa Schaefer, Otto's youngest, to 15-year-old James Preston, who was technically old enough to be done with school but whose mother had insisted he continue, and who had, to everyone's surprise including his own, turned out to have a real aptitude for arithmetic that Susan was quietly nurturing. Micah went to a parent evening at the church in March and sat in the back with Burl Pickett and listened to Susan explain her curriculum for the term and answer questions from the assembled parents with the patient authority of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and Burl leaned over and said in a low voice, "You're a lucky man, Micah." And Micah said, "I know," without any argument. What he did not know, at the beginning of March, was that he was going to be confronted with the past before the spring was finished. The confrontation came in the form of a letter, which arrived via the stage from Laramie on a Tuesday, addressed to him in a handwriting he recognized immediately and had not expected to see again. He stood at Otto Schaefer's counter and looked at the letter in his hand for a moment before opening it. Clara Hutchins, who was apparently now Clara Crane, wrote in the flowing script she had always had, which was prettier than her handwriting had any practical need to be. And she wrote from Denver, and she wrote that Hollis Crane had died of pneumonia in January, and that she was a widow, and that she had been thinking about Wyoming Territory and about him. And she wondered in the way that Clara wondered things, all easy charm and rounded edges, whether Micah was still at Caldwell Creek. He folded the letter and stood at Otto's counter for a long moment. He thought about 3 years. He thought about every window. He thought about Susan Norris on the front porch in the morning light saying, "Finally." He thought about the 40 acres and the cattle and colt and the kitchen table and the notebook and the way she had broken ice for an hour in the February cold without complaint because it needed doing. He went home. Susan was at the school. He sat at the kitchen table and wrote a reply. He told Clara, with the courtesy that was due a widow and the clarity that was due both of them, that he hoped she was well, that he was sorry for her loss, and that he had found himself, in the time since she left, in a situation of considerable happiness, and wished her every good thing going forward. He sealed it and sent it back with the next stage. He told Susan about it that evening. He did not want to not tell her because he had decided that honesty was the currency of this particular relationship, and he intended to keep his accounts clean. He told her simply, there had been a letter from Clara Hutchins, now widowed, asking after him. He had replied politely and finally and wished her well. Susan listened. She was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, which she had introduced to the kitchen to supplement the constant coffee supply, and she held the cup in both hands and looked at it while he talked. When he finished, she said, "How did it feel, getting the letter?" "Like something I had already put down a long time ago and someone had handed back to me to confirm I was finished with it," he said. She looked up. "And are you?" "Yes," he said. He held her gaze. "Entirely." She nodded once and set down her cup and said, "Good," and then after a small pause, "Thank you for telling me." "Always," he said. That was the end of it. Clara Crane went back to Denver, and the letter, and what it represented, receded into the past where it belonged. And what remained was the house, and the 40 acres, and the spring coming green, and Susan Norris at the kitchen table with her tea and her school papers, and her unflinching, honest eyes. April arrived, and with April came the question that had been building for some time. He had been thinking about it since February. He had thought about it carefully, the way he thought about things he meant, and he had settled it in himself the way his grandfather had taught him to settle joints in wood, with the patience to let everything fit properly before you drove the nail. He asked her on an April evening after supper. Not with elaborate planning or unusual circumstance, because she was not a woman who required elaborate planning and unusual circumstance, and because the kitchen with the stove warm and cold between their feet and the night pressing the windows was the truest version of the life he was asking her to share. "Susan," he said. She looked up from her papers. He set down his coffee cup. "I know this was not where you were going," he said. "You were going north. You ended up here because a wheel broke and you went the wrong direction. And I was here because I had spent 3 years building something for reasons that I understand now were never the right ones." He paused. "I think the wrong direction brought you to the right place, and I think the wrong reasons produced something that was waiting for the right person." He paused again. He was not a man of many words, but he had enough of them for this. "I would like you to marry me. Not because the house needs someone in it, but because I want it to be yours. I want all of it to be yours. The land and the work and the kitchen and the window that catches the morning light and whatever else comes after. I want it to be ours." She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was not the controlled practicality, and it was not the warm amusement, and it was not the focused intensity she brought to teaching. It was something more open than any of those, as if all the layers she usually kept in careful order had relaxed at once. She said, "Micah Keene." "Yes," he said. "I came here because a wheel broke," she said. "You did." "I stayed because of the school." You did. And I fell in love with you, she said, and said it simply and directly and without any surrounding decoration, in exactly the way she said true things. Because you are the most solid and honest and genuinely good person I have ever known. And yes, she looked at him. Yes, I will marry you. He stood up from the table, and she stood up too, and he took her hands and held them, and she looked up at him with her honest eyes bright and warm. And Colt, who had excellent instincts, wagged his tail against the floor in a steady congratulatory rhythm. They were married in June of 1879 by Reverend Foster in the church at Caldwell Creek, in front of the whole settlement, which was to save 40 families and 16 school children, and Burl and Nadine Pickett in the front row with expressions of profound satisfaction, and Otto Schaefer, who cried a little into his handkerchief and would deny it to his dying day, and Tommy Aldridge, who was 17 by now, and had recovered sufficiently from his earlier admiration to serve as one of the witnesses with dignity. Susan wore a dress that Nadine Pickett had helped her make from pale blue cotton that she had ordered specially from Laramie, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers that the schoolchildren had gathered that morning. And when she walked into the church, she looked neither left nor right, but directly at Micah, who was standing at the front in his good dark coat that he had worn exactly twice before, and her expression when she looked at him was the one he had learned to love best, the open one. The one without the layers. He had the ring from a jeweler in Red Bend, a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone, because he had seen her looking at a piece of turquoise jewelry in Otto's store, once, with the brief involuntary appreciation of a person who does not intend to want things but occasionally wants things anyway. And he had remembered it in the way he had learned with Clara to file away the details of a woman's desires. The difference was that this time the details were true ones, not wishful ones, and the woman was standing in front of him at the church altar with wildflowers in her hands, and the certainty of her choice clear and unmistakable in every line of her face. Reverend Foster spoke the service in the way he spoke everything, with honest simplicity and a genuine warmth, and Micah said his vows looking at Susan, and meaning every single word with the totality of a man who had waited 31 years to say something he was entirely sure of. She said hers looking at him in the same way, clear and direct and true, and when Reverend Foster said, "You may kiss your bride," Micah kissed her without any of the logistical awkwardness of the porch in February, because this time they both knew exactly what was happening. The settlement celebrated in the way small communities celebrated in the Wyoming Territory of 1879, with a long table outside the church set with food that every family had contributed, and music from 3 men who between them played a fiddle, a harmonica, and a battered guitar, and dancing in the dirt while the June evening went golden and warm around them. Burl Pickett danced with Nadine with the practiced ease of 29 years. Tommy Aldridge danced with Otto's daughter Elsa, who was 9 and found the situation hilarious. Susan danced with Micah, which neither of them did particularly gracefully, but they danced, and the fiddle played, and Caldwell Creek turned out to be the kind of place that could hold a proper celebration when it was needed. They drove home in the wagon in the late evening, just the 2 of them and Colt in the bed, and the house was lit from inside by the lamp she had left burning, and it looked from the road the way it had looked to her on the first day, November gray and sleet-washed, beautiful, substantial. Something that had been built with care and intention and would stand for a long time. "Mrs. Keene," he said, trying it out. She turned to look at him on the wagon seat. "I'm keeping Norris for teaching," she said. "Of course," he said. She smiled. "Mrs. Keene for the rest of it." He put his arm around her on the wagon seat and she leaned into it, and they drove up the approach to the house with the June stars coming out over Wyoming Territory and everything that had happened and everything that was going to happen arranged around them like a country they had decided to settle in permanently. In the years that followed, the house that Micah Keene had spent 3 years building for a woman who left him without a word became something that neither of his original intentions had imagined. It became a home in the full sense, which is a different and larger thing than a house, filled with the particular warmth of people who have chosen each other deliberately, and maintained that choice through the accumulated small decisions of daily life. The school grew. By the time 1880 arrived, Susan had 20 students and had convinced Reverend Foster and the school board, which now included Micah as a board member, that a dedicated school building was necessary. The new building went up the following spring, built largely by Micah and Pete Darrow and 3 other men from the settlement who gave their labor on weekends, and Susan watched its construction with an expression that Micah recognized as the one she wore when something important was taking shape. "You enjoy building," she said, watching him frame the classroom windows on a Saturday morning. "I like to see a thing become what it's going to be," he said. "That's why you're good at it," she said. "You're patient. You know it won't look finished until it's finished." "My grandfather's lesson," he said. "It's a good one," she said, and handed him the next plank. Their son was born in February of 1881, which was a difficult month for a birth, but a month that Wyoming Territory seemed to arrange such things in regardless of preferences. He was born in the east bedroom of the house, the bedroom with the window that Micah had built to catch the morning light, and he was born healthy and loud and determined about it, which his mother said was an excellent beginning. They named him Joseph, after Micah's grandfather, the carpenter. He was a fair-haired baby who grew into a dark-haired toddler who found Colt, now older and slower but still fundamentally optimistic, to be the most interesting entity in the world, and who began speaking in clear, full sentences at an age that made Susan nod with a kind of professional satisfaction. Burl Pickett held him on the day he was born, this enormous weathered rancher standing in the kitchen with the newborn in his arms like he was holding something astonishing, and said to Micah, "A boy. You'll have work to do." "I always have work to do," Micah said. "Different work now," Burl said. And his eyes were bright in a way that made Micah understand that Burl Pickett, who said true things carelessly and without sufficient warning, was saying another true thing, and it was one he was grateful for. The territory of Wyoming in those years was a place of considerable change. The railroad had come through, transforming what had been weeks of travel into days, and new settlements were growing and old ones expanding, and the great free range that the cattle barons had relied on was coming into contest with the homesteaders moving in on every train. There were tensions Micah was aware of, the kind that ran deep through the land itself, disputes over water rights and grazing and fencing. He kept himself out of the worst of it, because he believed in property rights, and he believed in the law, and he believed that most disagreements about land could be settled without anyone dying if people were willing to be reasonable, which they were not always willing to be. There was a period in the summer of 1882 when a man named Decker, who ran a large cattle operation to the south, decided that the fence line between his property and Burl Pickett's was incorrectly placed, and that Burl owed him 300 yards of range. Decker was not a man who made his case politely. He sent 2 men to pull down a section of Burl's fence, and when Burl rebuilt it, he sent a different 2 men to pull it down again. Micah went with Burl to talk to Decker. He wore his revolver because that was the language of credibility in a land dispute in Wyoming Territory in 1882, but he wore it holstered and spoke first and calmly. He pointed out that the survey records in Red Bend clearly established the property line, that Burl had those records and Decker was welcome to inspect them, and that pulling down a man's fence was a matter that could be taken before the county court if Decker preferred that avenue, and that Micah personally would be happy to ride to Red Bend with Burl and file the appropriate complaint. Decker looked at both of them, assessed the situation, and decided that the survey records were probably sufficient. The fence stayed up. Burl thanked Micah with a bottle of whiskey and the information that Micah was the only man he knew who could settle a thing like that without anyone raising their voice. "Susan's influence," Micah said. "Probably," Burl agreed. She's improved you considerably." Micah told Susan this, and she laughed and said she had done nothing of the sort, and he said she had done exactly that, and she said, "You were always good, Micah. I just gave you somewhere to be it." And that was one of the things she said that he kept in the same private place he kept his grandfather's lessons, because they were equally valuable. Their second child was born in the spring of 1883, a girl this time, and they named her Anne. And she was dark-eyed and serious from the beginning in the way of certain children who seemed to have arrived already knowing things. She watched everything carefully from the very start. Susan said she reminded her of someone and then looked at Micah and said, "You, actually." And he said he was not particularly serious as a child, and she said, "Your face says otherwise," which made him laugh. Joseph at 2 was a physical and enthusiastic presence who had decided that Colt, now very old and moving very slowly, was his particular companion and responsibility, and he spent considerable energy ensuring that Colt was comfortable and fed and appreciated, which was an instinct that made both his parents watch him with a quiet pride. Colt died in the autumn of 1883. He was old, certainly, and he had been slowing for a year, and on a September morning he did not get up from his corner of the kitchen, and Micah sat with him for the morning until it was clear that the life was going out of him. He buried Colt under the cottonwood tree behind the barn, and Joseph, who was 2 years old and only partially understood death but understood loss, stood beside Micah at the grave with his small hand in his father's large one and was very quiet. That evening Susan said, "He had an extraordinarily good life for a 3-legged dog," and Micah said, "He did," and meant it not only about the dog but about the general principle, which was that the loss of a leg was not the loss of a life, and that what you had left after a loss was still sufficient to be cheerful about. There was a period in 1884 when Susan was approached by a school board in a larger town 2 days east called Marchfield, which had a proper brick schoolhouse and a salary twice what Caldwell Creek could offer, and a position with genuine professional recognition. The letter came in March, and she showed it to Micah that evening without preamble. He read it. He looked at it for a long time. He handed it back. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think it's a real offer," he said. "It's legitimate. It's more money." "It would mean moving," she said. "Yes," he said. He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" "I want to know what you think," she said. "I think the school here needs you," he said carefully. "And I think you built something here, not just the teaching. The children here know you, they trust you. Elsa Schaefer, when she had that trouble with her reading, you spent 4 months on it, every Tuesday and Thursday after the school day. She reads well now. She wouldn't have gotten that at Marchfield." Susan was quiet. "But," he said, because he meant to be honest, "if you want Marchfield, we can find a way. The land can be managed. Burl Pickett's nephew has been looking for property to work. It's not impossible." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she folded the letter and set it on the table. "I built something here," she said, which was almost exactly what he had said, and was said with the tone of a person confirming a decision they had already made. "You did," he said. "And so did you," she said. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "So did you." She wrote to Marchfield politely and declined. Caldwell Creek did not know what it had almost lost and went about its business, which was Caldwell Creek's way. In 1886, the settlement had grown enough to incorporate properly, and there was a proper election for a town council, and Micah was asked to stand by half the population, and declined twice before Susan told him, with calm directness, that he was going to stand because the alternative was a man named Hargrove who had strong opinions about property taxes and weak opinions about public buildings, and Micah stood and was elected. It was not work he had ever imagined doing. He was not, by nature or preference, a political man. But he was trusted because he was fair, and because he said what he meant and meant what he said, and because he had the kind of deliberate, unhurried judgment that small communities in difficult country needed from the people they put in charge of their common concerns. He served 2 terms and declined a third, and said that was enough, and went back to his cattle and his fence lines and his family. The house, by the late 1880s, had changed in the way houses change when they are properly lived in. The wide plank floors had the patina of years. The kitchen table had the mark of Joseph's first attempt to carve his initials, which Susan had addressed with considerable firmness, and which had faded now to a pale shadow of letters that she eventually said were history rather than damage. The east bedroom window still caught the morning light and poured it across the floor, and sometimes, on the mornings when Susan was still asleep and the light came in across her face, Micah would look at it and think about the woman who had described wanting exactly that, and about the fact that the thing we build in hope of one thing is sometimes waiting for something we cannot yet imagine. He never tried to explain that thought exactly, because he was not an explaining kind of man, but he understood it, and the understanding was sufficient. Joseph Keene started working the land seriously alongside his father at 14, which was 1895, and he had his grandfather's carpenter eye and his mother's clarity of thought in something that was entirely his own, which was a steady good humor in the face of difficulty that made people around him feel calmer. He was not interested in teaching, despite his mother's careful observation, but he was deeply interested in horses, and by the time he was 20, he had developed a small side business in Caldwell Creek, which was growing into a proper small town by then, of training and trading horses that had a genuine reputation for quality and honesty in the surrounding territory. Ann Keene, at 15, was helping her mother with the school and had the same gift for it, that ability to see what a student needed and provide it, and by 1898, she was teaching the younger children alongside Susan, with a competence that made Susan look at her daughter sometimes with an expression that mixed enormous pride with the recognition of something she saw in a mirror. The century turned. In January of 1900, the family sat together at the kitchen table, the same table that had hosted the first cup of coffee in the sleet, the Christmas cake from Ohio, the cornbread and the newspaper, the years of suppers and school papers and ledger books and conversations. Joseph was 19. Anne was 16. Micah was 52 and Susan was 47, and they had been married 20 years and lived in a house he had built over 3 years for reasons that had turned out to be entirely wrong, and everything around them was entirely right. There was a particular evening in that winter of 1900 when Susan came out to the porch where Micah was standing, which was a thing he still did in the evenings, looking at the land in the dark the way he always had. She stood beside him, and they looked at the 40 acres, and the creek and the barn and the dark shape of the cottonwood where Colt was buried, and the fence line that ran true and level all the way to the road. "I was trying to get to Fort Keswick," she said. She said it lightly with the warm amusement that 20 years of a good life had put in her voice. "I know," he said. "What do you think would have happened if the wheel had held?" He considered it. "You'd have got to Fort Keswick, found out the position was filled, figured out something else." "Something else," she said. "You were going somewhere," he said. "You always were. I just happened to be in the way." She turned and looked at him in the darkness. "You were not in the way," she said. "You were exactly in the right place." He put his arm around her. She leaned into it just as she had on the wagon on their wedding night, the same instinctive lean, the trust of someone who knows what they are leaning into. "Do you remember the first morning?" he asked. "When you came to the door, you were soaking wet." "I was," she said, "and you opened the door and stood there, and I thought, that is the most self-contained face I have ever seen. This man is keeping everything inside." "I was," he said. "And then you stepped back from the door," she said, "and you just said, 'Come inside.' No explanation, no reassurance, no asking me to prove I was harmless. Just come inside." "You were standing in a sleet storm," he said. "I know," she said. "But it was the way you said it, like it was simply obvious that a person in a sleet storm should come inside." She was quiet for a moment. "That's when I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were the kind of man who did the right thing because it was right," she said, "not because someone was watching." He was quiet for a moment. The creek was talking to itself in the dark the way it always did in winter. "I built the house badly," he said, "for the wrong reasons." "You built it beautifully," she said. For reasons that became right. That's generous, he said. It's accurate, she said. And I am almost never generous where accuracy would do. He laughed low and warm. She heard it and smiled against his shoulder. 20 years, he said. 20 years, she said. In the spring of 1900, Joseph Keene married a young woman named Martha Aldridge, who was Tommy Aldridge's younger sister and who was 22 years old, and shared Joseph's calm practical nature and his particular love of horses, and who brought into the family a kind of laughing warmth that made the kitchen feel even larger than it was. The wedding was in the same church where Micah and Susan had been married 21 years earlier, now properly expanded, and with a real wooden floor that Micah had helped lay in 1888. They moved into the house, for the time being, which was a larger household than any of them had managed before, but which worked because the house was built for it. 4 bedrooms and a wide kitchen, and the porch that went the full length of the front, and because Susan organized the practical logistics with the same competent grace she brought to everything. Anne continued teaching. In 1901, she took up full responsibility for the school when Susan decided that 30 years of teaching, counting the Ohio years, was sufficient, and that there were other things she wanted time for, including a serious effort at writing down everything she knew about the territory's natural history, which she had been observing and noting in a series of journals for 20 years, and which she believed was worth having on paper in an organized way. Micah watched her at this project with the quiet pride of a man watching someone he loves do something they are deeply suited for. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with her journals and her ink and her neat, precise handwriting, and the lamplight fell on the pages the way it had always fallen, and Colt was gone, and the children were grown, and the 40 acres were still theirs, and the creek still ran past the property. But the quality of the silence in those evenings was not empty at all. In the fall of 1901, Joseph and Martha had their first child, a boy they named William after Martha's father. He was a healthy, determined baby who from his first week in the house had the same physical certainty Joseph had had, the sense of a person who was planning to do considerable things. Susan held him in the east bedroom by the window that caught the morning light and looked at this new person with the particular expression of a grandmother, which is its own specific variety of love, and said to the baby, in the practical way she said important things, "You are going to be very interesting." Micah stood in the doorway and watched his wife hold his grandson and thought about the 40 acres and the 3 years and the sleet storm and all of it, the whole accumulated weight and grace of a life, and felt something so large and complete that it had no word in any language he knew, though he thought his grandfather might have had one, in the old Virginia woodshop, where the right side of wood was distinguished from the wrong side by patience and attention. The house stood. The windows faced east and the light came in the way he had always intended, and the wide plank floors carried the sounds of people moving through them, and the kitchen held the warmth from the stove, and outside the property ran to its fence lines which were straight and true, and the creek went on and would go on after all of them, which was not sad but only large and real. On an evening in October of 1902, Micah and Susan sat on the front porch of the house in the particular cool amber evening that Wyoming Territory produced in autumn, and the stars were beginning to come out over the enormous sky, and the property was quiet around them, and inside they could hear Martha singing something low to William, and from the barn Joseph was talking to the horses in the carrying dark. "I want to tell you something," Micah said. Susan turned to look at him. "I have thought occasionally over the years about the fact that I built this house wrong," he said. "Wrong reasons, wrong person, 3 years of work that was not what I thought it was." "Micah," she began. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I want to say that I understand now that there is no such thing as building wrong if what you build is true, the house is true. It was built with good wood and real labor, and it is standing and it will stand. The reasons changed, the person changed, but the house was always what it was going to be." He paused. "And I think my life is the same. I was always going to be here on this porch with you. The roads that got me here were wrong, some of them, but this is right." She looked at him for a long moment in the autumn evening. This woman who had been coming loose from her pins since the first day, and who was beautiful to him in every October and every February and every form of light and every state of the weather, and in the particular morning dark of the east bedroom and in the kitchen with her tea and her school papers, and in the way she said hard true things cleanly and moved on. "It is right," she said. "It is absolutely right." She took his hand. The stars were coming out fully now over Wyoming Territory, and the creek was speaking in its particular low voice, and the house behind them was solid and lit and full of the sounds of the life that had found it. And Micah Keene and Susan Norris Keene sat on the porch and held hands and watched the country they had chosen, and that had, in its way, chosen them back. The stage road was still there, 3 miles east. The rock cut where a wheel had broken in November of 1878 was still there, part of the landscape now, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what it had sent in the direction of this porch on this particular October evening. The school in the town proper was lit on 3 evenings a week now for adult education, Anne's idea, which was her mother's idea in another form. The cattle were in the lower pasture. The horses were in the barn. The fence lines ran true. The house stood on the 40 acres as it had always stood, facing east, and in the morning the light would come in the windows again and fall across the floors and touch the faces of the people inside, and it would be the same light and a different day and exactly as it should be, which is the best that any house or any life can hope to be. Micah squeezed Susan's hand once, firm and deliberate, the way he did everything he meant. She squeezed back. The October stars turned overhead, slow and ancient and entirely indifferent to the particulars of one man's 3 years, one woman's wrong turn, and the house between them that had been waiting, all along, for exactly this.